Late Friday evening at 7:46 p.m. local time on July 31st, 2026, the ground beneath Naples, Italy did something it hasn't done in 40 years. A magnitude 4. 7 earthquake tore through the Campi Flegrei volcanic area just west of the city, centered near the Solfatara crater in Pozzuoli, at a depth of only about 3 kilometers. It's now officially the strongest earthquake recorded in this region since continuous instrumental monitoring began, surpassing 2 magnitude 4. 6 events that had each, in their own moment, been called the strongest in decades. 21 people were injured, buildings collapsed, train lines shut down, a port closed, and underneath all of it sits Europe's largest active volcanic caldera, a system that has been quietly and steadily accelerating for the past 20 years. Tonight, we're breaking down exactly what happened in Naples, what the science says about why this kept happening, and what a genuinely alarming new research paper says could be coming by the early 2030s. Before we get into it, drop a comment below. If you've ever visited Naples, Pozzuoli, or the Amalfi Coast, did you know you were standing on top of an active supervolcano? Let me know. And if you want to keep tracking this story as it develops, because this is very much still developing, subscribe. It's free. And this is exactly the kind of slow-building crisis that's easy to miss until a night like Friday forces everyone to pay attention. Let's get into it. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the details matter here. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known as INGV, confirmed the epicenter of Friday's magnitude, 4. 7 quake sat near the Solfatara crater in Pozzuoli, just 3 kilometers underground, shallow enough that nearly all of its energy hit the surface directly. Civil protection officials described it as the most powerful earthquake recorded in the area since continuous monitoring began. At least 10 aftershocks followed through the night, the largest a magnitude 3. 8 that struck at 10 p.m. in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, and residents reported a swarm of more than 30 separate tremors before morning. People across Pozzuoli, Bagnoli, and western Naples spent the night outdoors, many choosing to sleep in their cars rather than return to buildings they weren't sure were safe, a precaution familiar to residents there from prior seismic events in recent years. The damage was real, though officials were careful to note it could have been far worse. 2 uninhabited buildings collapsed in Pozzuoli, and the facade of a third came down, but nobody was trapped or injured in those collapses specifically. Firefighters responded to reports of falling plaster, cracked walls, and dislodged cornices across Pozzuoli and Bagnoli. In the Girolomini area, a hillside collapse sent large boulders crashing down onto parked cars, footage that circulated widely within hours. A high-voltage electricity pylon partially collapsed in the Agnano area of Naples, cutting power across parts of the city and Pozzuoli, with street lighting restored only gradually through the night. Italy's Civil Protection Minister, Nello Musumeci, confirmed 21 people were injured, with 2 admitted to hospital in serious condition, though the majority of injuries were minor, mostly from falls or from people fleeing their homes in the chaos of the moment. Damage to churches and older residential buildings was also confirmed. Italy's Civil Protection Agency activated its crisis response unit, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was reported to be following the situation closely. The practical disruption extended well beyond the immediate quake zone. The Cumana and Circumflegrei railways, which serve the western Naples suburbs and the Pozzuoli corridor, were halted entirely for safety inspections. The main Naples rail hub, including high-speed Trenitalia service, was suspended while engineers checked the network, with service only resuming overnight after delays exceeding 6 hours. The port of Pozzuoli was closed outright after the quake caused deep cracks in the access lanes to its commercial quays, cutting off the standard ferry route to the islands of Procida and Ischia during peak summer tourist season. As of Saturday morning, no formal evacuation of Naples or its metropolitan area had been ordered, and INGV's position, consistent with its statements after prior seismic events in this area, is that there are currently no signs pointing toward an imminent volcanic eruption. But the agency was equally explicit that the Phlegraean system will continue generating seismic activity and that stronger tremors cannot be ruled out. Now here's where this becomes bigger than a single dramatic night, because Friday's earthquake didn't come out of nowhere. It's the latest, sharpest data point in a pattern of accelerating unrest that's been building at Campi Flegrei for 2 full decades. Campi Flegrei isn't a single cone-shaped mountain the way most people picture a volcano. It's a vast underground caldera system spanning roughly 130 square kilometers west of Naples and beneath the Bay of Pozzuoli, formed by eruptions so large in prehistory that they collapsed the ground above the emptied magma chamber into the massive depression that exists today. The ground here moves in a process called bradyseism, a slow rising and falling driven by magmatic fluids and gases shifting beneath the surface. Since the current phase of unrest began around 2005, the ground near Pozzuoli has risen by more than 140 centimeters, roughly 4.5 feet of cumulative uplift, at a monthly rate that has recently run around 10 millimeters, with some periods over the past decade reaching as high as 15 to 20 millimeters a month. That uplift has cracked buildings in Pozzuoli, buckled streets, and forced the harbor to be dredged periodically simply because the seafloor itself keeps rising. And crucially, the rate of earthquakes hasn't just tracked passively alongside that uplift. A study published in Nature Communications in late 2024 that mapped seismicity against deformation data found the relationship between the two has become distinctly nonlinear since 2005, meaning earthquakes have been accelerating faster than the uplift alone would predict, a signature researchers associate with a system under increasing mechanical stress. This is the context that makes Friday's magnitude 4, 7 so significant, because it fits a pattern that has been getting worse, not better, roughly year over year. Records show a magnitude 4. 6 struck the area in June 2025, itself described at the time as the strongest tremor in the region in 40 years. Now, just over a year later, that record has already been broken. Civil protection officials and INGV have both acknowledged this exact pattern of successive record-breaking quakes, each one surpassing the last within a relatively short window, which is precisely the kind of trend that shifts a story from "there was an earthquake" to "there is an ongoing crisis." And this is where the research gets genuinely serious, because it's not just retrospective analysis of what's already happened. It's a forward-looking projection that's been making waves in the volcanology community since it was published earlier this year. In April 2026, researchers published a paper analyzing decades of seismic and ground deformation data from Campi Flegrei, titled "Accelerating Unrest at Campi Flegrei Signals a Critical Transition Within the Next Decade." Rather than modeling the acceleration in deformation and seismicity as simple exponential growth, the kind of steady curve that just keeps climbing indefinitely, the researchers found the data fit a different mathematical pattern far better, something called a finite time singularity, a trend that doesn't just accelerate forever, but converges toward a specific window in time. When they ran that analysis across multiple independent datasets separately, ground uplift rates, earthquake frequency, and CO2 flux from the volcanic system's fumaroles, all three converged on roughly the same critical window, somewhere between 2030 and 2034. The same research projected that ground uplift could reach approximately 4 meters total by the early 2030s, if the current trend continues on its present trajectory. It's critical to be precise about what that projected critical transition actually means, because it is not the same thing as a predicted eruption date, and conflating the two would be a serious misrepresentation of what this research actually says. The paper's authors describe the projected threshold as a potential critical mechanical threshold, a point where the system could undergo what they call a regime change, which might mean new ground fractures opening, a measurable jump in fumarole and gas activity, or other significant physical shifts in how the caldera behaves. It does not automatically mean a volcanic eruption. Researchers have been explicit that this kind of mechanical threshold is a meaningfully different and less catastrophic category of event than an eruption itself, even though crossing it would still represent a serious escalation in the unrest the region has already been living through for 20 years. Independent volcanologists reviewing this kind of forecasting model have also cautioned that finite time singularity models, while mathematically well supported by the historical data, still carry real uncertainty when projected forward, since complex geological systems don't always continue following the same mathematical pattern once conditions shift. Put those two threads together, Friday night's record-breaking earthquake and this year's accelerating unrest research, and you get a genuinely serious situation, even without any exaggeration. More than 500,000 people live within the Italian government's officially designated red zone at Campi Flegrei, the 15 municipalities considered most at risk if unrest were to escalate rapidly. The Italian government updated its mass evacuation contingency plans for this exact region in 2023 and 2024, specifically in response to the rising activity that's been building for years, plans that exist precisely because officials take the accelerating trend seriously, even while stressing that no eruption appears imminent right now. Campi Flegrei's last actual eruption was in 1538, a week-long event that built an entirely new small mountain, Monte Nuovo, and it remains one of the most densely and continuously monitored volcanic systems on the planet, watched by INGV's Osservatorio Vesuviano, one of the most sophisticated geophysical monitoring networks in the world. It's worth understanding Campi Flegrei's full eruptive history, not just its most recent 1538 event, because it puts the scale of what this caldera is actually capable of into perspective. Long before Monte Nuovo formed, Campi Flegrei produced 2 eruptions, large enough to be classified among the most powerful volcanic events in European history. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, roughly 39,000 years ago, is estimated to have ejected somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 cubic kilometers of material, an eruption large enough that some researchers have linked its climate effects to disruptions felt across the wider Mediterranean and possibly beyond. A second major eruption, the Neapolitan yellow tuff event around 15,000 years ago, was smaller but still massive by any modern standard, and is what created much of the caldera structure that defines the region today. Both of those events happened on a timescale so far outside human history that they're studied primarily through geological deposits rather than any written record. The 1538 eruption that built Monte Nuovo, by contrast, is well documented, a comparatively small event that still displaced the town of Pozzuoli's population for a week and permanently altered the coastline. That range, from a civilization shaping super eruption tens of thousands of years ago down to a contained week-long event 5 centuries back, is part of why volcanologists are careful never to treat unrest is accelerating as automatically meaning a super eruption is coming. The overwhelming majority of Campi Flegre's activity throughout its history, including right now, falls into smaller categories of unrest, bradyseismic cycles, moderate earthquakes, and localized gas and fluid activity, not caldera-forming eruptions. It's also worth noting how this recent earthquake fits into a broader pattern of swarms that have been building specifically over the past year and a half. Back in February 2025, a seismic swarm at Campi Flegrei produced 282 recorded earthquakes over the following days, 5 of which reached magnitude 3 or higher, including 2 separate magnitude 3. 9 events in different seismogenic zones beneath the caldera. That swarm was, at the time, one of the more significant clusters INGV had logged since the current unrest began accelerating. Friday's magnitude for 4. 7 single event surpassed the largest individual quake from that entire multi-day swarm in one shock, which is exactly the kind of comparison that illustrates how quickly the upper end of this activity has been climbing over a relatively short period. If you're anywhere in the Naples region or planning travel there in the coming weeks, here's what's actually useful to know rather than just alarming. Follow INGV's official monitoring portal and Italy's Civil Protection Department directly for verified updates rather than relying on secondhand social media reports, since both organizations publish detailed, regularly updated information specifically for this region. If you feel strong shaking, move away from buildings, balconies, and anything that could fall. And if you're indoors, get under sturdy furniture until the shaking stops. The same basic guidance that applies to any earthquake-prone region. Check transit status directly with Trenitalia and EAV before relying on the Cumana, Circumflegrea, or main rail hub. And check directly with ferry operators serving Ischia and Procida before assuming normal port operations from Pozzuoli, since infrastructure disruptions like Fridays have become a recurring rather than rare feature of travel through this specific corridor. None of this means avoiding the region entirely. Millions of people live in and visit Naples and the surrounding area every year, but it does mean building a bit more flexibility into any itinerary that depends on transportation running through the Campi Flegrei corridor specifically. So what happens next and what are scientists actually watching for? In the immediate term, INGV and Italy's Civil Protection Department are continuing structural assessments across Pozzuoli and western Naples, checking churches, older residential buildings, and the rail and port infrastructure that was damaged or closed. Aftershock activity is expected to continue for some time following an event of this magnitude, and residents have been advised to follow official guidance rather than informal reports. In the medium term, researchers will be watching whether this quake represents a genuine step change in the underlying trend, or simply the latest, currently largest event within the same gradual acceleration that's been running since 2005. And in the longer term, the 2030 to 2034 window identified in this year's research will remain the benchmark the volcanological community uses to evaluate whether Campi Flegrei's unrest is tracking toward or diverging from the projected critical mechanical threshold, with each new data point, like Friday's earthquake, feeding directly back into that ongoing analysis. It's also worth situating Campi Flegrei among the small number of comparably monitored volcanic systems worldwide, because it isn't the only densely populated caldera scientists are watching for exactly this kind of accelerating unrest. Yellowstone in the United States and the Taupo volcanic zone in New Zealand are both large calderas under continuous instrumental monitoring, but neither sits beneath a metropolitan area anywhere near the scale of Naples, a city of roughly 3 million people in its greater metropolitan area, sitting partly inside and directly adjacent to an active caldera experiencing 2 decades of accelerating unrest. That combination, a genuinely restless volcanic system directly beneath one of Europe's largest urban populations, is part of why Campi Flegrei draws such intense scientific attention and such carefully prepared civil protection planning, even during long stretches when nothing dramatic is happening on the surface. INGV's Osservatorio Vesuviano runs one of the densest geophysical monitoring networks anywhere in the world, specifically because of that population density, combining seismometers, GPS ground deformation stations, gas and geochemical sampling at the Solfatara fumarole field, and satellite radar measurements, all feeding into the kind of real-time and long-term data sets that made this year's accelerating unrest study possible in the first place. Here's the bottom line. Friday night's magnitude 4.7 earthquake at Campe Flegrei is now the strongest recorded in the region in 40 years, injuring 21 people and disrupting rail and port infrastructure across Naples during peak tourist season. It's not an isolated shock. It's the latest and largest event within a documented accelerating 20-year trend of rising ground deformation and increasingly frequent earthquakes, one that a major 2026 study projects could reach some kind of critical mechanical threshold sometime between 2030 and 2034. INGV maintains there's no sign of an imminent eruption, and that assessment hasn't changed tonight. But no imminent eruption and nothing serious is happening are two very different statements, and Friday made that distinction impossible to ignore for the 500,000 people who live inside Europe's most closely watched volcanic red zone. We'll keep tracking this story closely, every INGV update, every aftershock, and any new research on where this accelerating trend is actually headed. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And tell me in the comments, if you're anywhere near Naples or the Campi Flegrei region right now, what did Friday night actually feel like, and has this changed how you think about living there or visiting? See you in the next one.